and welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. In our continuing examination of nation-to-nation trade links, today we look at Canada and Cuba. Bilateral trade is almost $1 billion, with Canada importing nickel, cigars, lobsters, and rum. Canada is one of the largest foreign direct investors in Cuba as well. Here to discuss this relationship is Nancy Lussier. She is the president of the Canada-Cuba Industry Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for being here and welcome to our show, Nancy.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Just an interesting topic for, I'm sure, many of our viewers probably haven't thought of an industry link with Cuba. Obviously, tourism is the thing that comes to mind for a lot of Canadians when it comes to Cuba. But maybe tell us the importance, firstly, of the Cuban market to Canada and also the Canadian market to Cuba.
Perfect. So the Cuban market is our first market in the Caribbean. Canada and Cuba have a long trade relationship. We also have a bilateral relation uninterrupted since more than 70 years. So we are leader in this market. And also we are importing a lot of Cuban product to Canada, basically in the mining sector, but also in some other sector like agri-food and some other sector. So Canadians are well recognized there, and our business have really achieved to create some win-win trade with the Cuban industry.
Yeah, and as I was mentioning off the top of the show, there is a lot of foreign direct investment from Canada into Cuba as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, in the foreign investment, we are present in the mining sector, but also in the tourism sector, and more in the agri-food sector and in the industry sector also. So we have created new models ultimately that are really interesting because they are win-win for both parts. One of them have been the co-production. So it's something that is really interesting. You know that actually our company, the industry in Canada, are facing a labor shortage. So when you have a Canadian production, you could send semi-assembled production to Cuba, and they are going to finish the production and add their value to the production. Then after, it could be directly export to the local market, but to all the Caribbean zone, and even re-import to Canada. So it's something that is really interesting. We have some members who experience it in the transport sector, in the parts manufacturing, and it works really, really well. So we believe it's a win-win. Cuban population is well educated, and also all the industry have a lot of infrastructure. So it's project that won't need a big investment to be possible to achieve. When people were thinking in investment, they were always thinking that it was something difficult to achieve in Cuba due to the hard bureaucracy, to the heavy bureaucracy, and also to the big amount that were necessary. But those new models that are more flexible, that have been put in place since few months, really help the Canadian entrepreneurs, like more SMEs company, to start to doing investment in Cuba.
Yeah, and I do want to ask you about the bureaucracy a little bit later in the program, but I am interested in your point. So is this a new thing then, that these, I would call them joint ventures or co-productions, this is being considered now because of the supply chain crisis that we're facing?
Exactly. It could be think in function of the supply chain, but it have been think really because we were having some Canadian company that were facing the labor shortage. So only with our local market, it was difficult thinking and growing and making exportation. In the case of Cuba, it was possible to enter in that market for doing the co-production with them. So they completely assemble, and their local market have a lot of needs. So it's already a first market that established the stability of the investment that you do there. And after that, there's the Caribbean zone that is really, really interesting for our Canadian market. So we all know that we are trying to achieve the goals of the Canadian government to diversify our exportation. And for us, the Caribbean market is an interesting one to achieve it. So if we want to achieve that goals, not only depending on our US export, but really trying to develop on new markets,
right,
it's a way to do it Cuba is really well positioning in that place.
Right.
So it helps us on all the zone and also to re-import to Canada, which is really interesting.
We're going to take a brief break. Nancy, we'll be right back with you after these messages. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, at the News Forum here with Nancy Lussier. She is the president of the Canada-Cuba Chamber of Commerce. Nancy, I'd like to ask, just because this is this is one of these relationships that is affected by, of course, the big elephant in the room, which is the Cuban-USA relationship. And of course, that's been a challenge on and off with embargoes. And I'm just wondering how that relationship impacts on Canadian businesses in Cuba.
Of course. We could not underestimate the impact of the embargo on the Cuban economy and on the relation that we have with the Cubans' economy. So the first thing that is important for the entrepreneurs to understand is that there is an embargo in place. So Canadian could not send US goods to Cuba through Canada. But we have Canadian law that authorized us and allowed us to protect our own sovereignty in business with Cuba regarding the exportation of Canadian goods. So that's the first thing that is really important. But the embargo have a lot of impacts in the export, but also in the financing sector. Mm-hmm. So actually, we have EDC and CCC who are involved a lot in the transaction to help the financing to support our Canadian exporter in doing business with Cuba. So they are approximately helping the Canadian business, all Canadian export, around 40% of all Canadian export to Cuba. So one thing that is complex, it's always the relation between Canadian law and American law.
Right.
So we have faced it ultimately because on those programs, they start to request to Canadian exporter to provide an annex, which is confirmation of origin of goods. This annex could seem simply, but it has created a situation that is really complicated for our Canadian exporter because they are requesting Canadian exporter when they're exporting Canadian goods to certify some condition in function of the US embargo.
Right.
I will just give you an example to make sure that it is more simplified. For example, in the export of potash. So, potash is one of our best Canadian products. They are produced in the mine of Saskatchewan. But in the export of Canadian potash, the exporter will need to certify that the goods are not involving in the exportation any entities directly or indirectly, which is really complicated for the exporter to do because we're not able to get all that information.
I see.
And it is also as our own regarding a direct application of the US embargo on Canadian transaction of Canadian goods. So the exporter who just has decided to refuse signing the annex have been not approved to do transaction under those programs. So it's go really, really far. And it is directly affecting our Canadian sovereignty, but also the competition to make sure that our enterprise are competitive when they are doing some trade. Mm-hmm. So it's something that is really strange that two crown corporations are actually, when they need to decide between Canadian law and American law, are deciding to use and do the transaction in function of the American law. And it's totally in contradiction with the position that the Canadian government have reiterated a lot of time to the Canadian exporter. So I could give you many quotes of Mrs. Freeland, of Mr. Champagne, or also Mr. Lamety, who have always said that regarding the US embargo, they are going to support Canadian sovereignty and making sure that we keep our leader position in that market. So there is one discourse and there's other things that are applicated in the reality. Right. And this is really hard, and that weight is all in the shoulders of the exporter right now. So we're trying to find some solution. And as an example of things that have been done in the past,
Sure.
under the government Harper, the use of the Canada account, which is directly the government who support the transaction, have been done. And it works really well. And it was possible to do business with Cuba under Canadian law. And it was not necessary to sign those type of annex. So solutions are possible, but the action didn't appear up to now. Another thing that is important is that recently in the parliament...
We're going to have to take a brief break. I'm sorry, we're just bumping up to our next commercial. I apologize for that. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Nancy Lussier. She is the president of the Canada-Cuba Industry Chamber of Commerce. Nancy, please finish your thought, and then I've got another question for you as well.
Perfect. So I was explaining that recently two motions was presented to the Canadian Parliament by Mr. Simon-Pierre Savard-Tremblay that was supported by all the parties to reiterate the protection of our commercial sovereignty. So following the Foreign Extraterritorial Act of 1992, FEMA. And it was opposed twice by liberal parties. So in the second time, it was directly by Minister Garneau. So you could understand in the situation that are actually the exporter, as few weeks later in the United Nations General Assembly, Minister Garneau votes as what Canada always have been our position in United Nations Assembly against the embargo on Cuba. So we really need to clarify the situation for our exporter now.
Gotcha. No, I'm glad you explained that because it is an important qualification. Let me ask you this, though. Canada has also been a human rights leader with its own human rights agenda, and including, obviously, in Cuba. So can business make a positive impact and make a positive difference with this human rights agenda while working in Cuba?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe that Canada's position has been the right one since all the last years, which means we have been creating bridge with Cuba with their enterprise. And also we saw actually that the SMEs model is going to happen in Cuba. It's actually happening now. So it's going to create interesting bridge. We could also saw that in the business development, there is always some important strength that are created between the two populations, the entrepreneurs from Canada and the entrepreneurs from Cuba. So I will say that for sure, I believe that the business is important to create those bridge, and that actually our position is the good one. Also, just to give you an example, when the United States tried to strengthen his link with Cuba a few years ago, they eventually passed through Canada to achieve it. So it means that I believe our models is the good one, and we are really trying to work giving the example of what we are doing on Canada, what we are doing on financing, what we are doing on business development, on Roman entrepreneurs, etc. So I believe we are doing the right thing actually, and that is totally in function of our agenda that you explained before.
Thank you for that. I do want to talk a little bit about what it's like working in a planned economy. Cuba still has a planned economy. I guess by your description, things are changing. And you mentioned the reducing red tape. So talk a little bit about that aspect of doing business in Cuba.
Okay. So the planned economy has positive things that could attract Canadian entrepreneurs. So a lot of time when we heard about planned economy, it's something completely different than what we have here. So we could have fears. But what we saw in the last years, for example, was that planned economy and those centralized economy had helped our business to have high volume of sold. So when here, it's a little bit complicated because sometimes we have cycle in the one we are having less business here locally in Canada. It helps a lot of the exporter who are doing business with Cuba to have an increase of their business and of their exports. So it has been positive. The other thing that it was maybe complicated and that we are trying to find other solution that we have achieved, it's when you are working with a planned economy and how Cuba was working it. They were needing a lot of financing, 360 days financing, right, which is really hard for an exporter to do with his own financing because it is affecting directly his cash flow. And actually, with the new models, this is changing. So we are trying to concentrate our exporters to do business with the Cuban company who have outside incomes, who are making export and making sure that we can have cycles that are more short so that we are going to do business at the right place, right, and making sure that the financing that we give is shaker by different models than what have been done in the past.
We're going to take another brief break, but we'll be back with Nancy Lussier after that break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Nancy Lussier. She is the president of the Canada-Cuba Industry Chamber of Commerce. Nancy, another issue that does spring to mind is the issue of corruption. Is this a big problem in Cuba when it comes to big business relations?
It's not a problem. I didn't saw in our members people who have to face this problem of corruption. For sure, we need to understand the situation that the incomes of the workers are not the same. So everybody knows, for example, it has been one thing that always it's one subject that everybody talks. So the incomes are lower, but it is possible to do transaction with Cuban entities that could be government entities, joint venture entities, and even now with the private sector that are not related to corruption. So I believe people more think about corruption because they're thinking that sometimes the incomes or the salary are low. So it directly takes in our mind that probably corruption is going to be a problem. I would say that it's a different country where you need to understand the local law to make sure that you respect it and that the business you're going to do is going to be the good one. When you're trying to enter in that market, you should have a view for a long time development. People who wants to just enter in the market, do a quick transaction and get out are not the type of exporter who will achieve to achieve it.
Right. Well, I'm going to shift gears and ask you about tourism. Obviously, that's something that comes to mind when Canadians think of Cuba. It must have been hit by COVID. Is the tourism economy recovering in Cuba right now?
It's going to start to recover. So actually in November 7, it's the opening of the border for the foreigners. So tourism is going to start again at a more high volume. So we know that the sanitary measures that have been put in place by the Cuban government have worked to occur that now the tourism is going to reopen. And for sure, it have hurt heavily the economy of Cuba because the tourism industry is one of the first income of the country. But for all our Canadians who appreciate to go to Cuba, appreciate the Cuban population and their beach, it's going to be fully recovered so people can go and travel there. And this is going to have an impact directly in all the Cuban economy for the private sector, for the government sector also. So it's going to dynamize a little bit the Cuban economy that will help all our bilateral transactions to continue and to be more with more volume.
We've got about a minute left. So I guess what would you like the federal government to do to help this trade relationship? Let's get back to that.
Yeah. So the first thing will be that we need a clarification from our government. I believe that our enterprise really need that. We also need to rethink the financing mechanism on Cuba to maintain our position of leader on that market. But we could not also think of that without getting more transparency in what is actually in place in our financing models, and always think that solution exists. They have been put in place before, so we could use those solutions again.
Well, a very interesting topic. Nancy Lussier, who is president of the Canada-Cuba Industry Chamber of Commerce, thanks for being on our program. Really interesting market. On this show, we look at big markets like India and China and other Asian countries and so on, but it's also important to know that we've got this long-standing relationship with the country of Cuba as well. So thanks for being part of our program today.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Interesting chat with Nancy Lussier there about the Canada-Cuba trade relationship. Obviously, a lot going on, and with COVID dissipating, more will happen there as well. But it's also important to talk about human rights and the embargo, some of these things that obviously keeps the pressure on the Cuban government to do better when it comes to respecting the rights of its population, and I think that should be part of our trade policy as well. So we'll see how that goes in the future, but thanks for watching today.